as talks continue in Geneva, will continue to strengthen the moderate opposition. That was what President Barack Obama said while hosting France in a lavish ceremony in Washington, a stance that was also shared by France. Why does the U.S. continue to think that arming the opposition will lead to a positive outcome, never mind what they call the moderate opposition? In this edition of the debate, we'll discuss the prospects of the Geneva conference, which the Syrian delegation says the focus should be on terrorism, not the transitional governing body, and why the prospects of parallel talks between Russia, U.S. and international mediator Lakhdar Brahimi also look to lead nowhere.
Syria's peace talks once again hit an impasse. Representatives of the government and foreign-backed opposition have confirmed that they have been unable to push the negotiations ahead over the priority of top demands by the two sides. While the government delegation says fighting terrorism should be the first priority in the Geneva talks, the opposition insists that the formation of a transitional government and the resignation of President Bashar al-Assad must come first.
The Syrian delegation has confirmed once again that it respects the will and determination of the Syrian people to stop violence, to stop terrorism.
Today we presented our main document outlining the various steps and principles that need to guide the transitional process.
Russia, the U.S., as well as the UN Arab League envoy Lakhdar Brahimi have held separate talks over Syria, which many construe as a sign that the negotiations in Geneva have failed. Meanwhile, fierce fighting continues between the Syrian army and foreign-backed insurgents in the key region of Qalamun near the Lebanese border, with the army making more gains. The army has seized control of the strategic town of Al-Jarajir. The Syrian warplanes also pounded the town of Yabrud, the last insurgents' stronghold in the mountainous Qalamun region. Meanwhile, in Homs, relief operations have resumed to ease the ordeal of the people in a besieged area of the city. The aid deliveries and evacuations come just a day after they were suspended due to what was described as logistical problems. Hundreds of civilians have already been moved out of the city as part of a UN-brokered deal between Damascus and the militants. The US and its Western allies have tried to take the issue of Homs to the UN Security Council. They are said to be seeking to circulate a draft resolution which would authorize the use of force against Syria if it fails to allow aid into Homs. Russia and China have said they will veto such a resolution. Meanwhile, the U.S. spy chief has called for military aid for insurgents. The U.S. National Intelligence Director, James Clapper, says more military training and equipment for the militants will boost them against Assad. Observers unanimously believe that Washington and its Western and regional allies have exerted all efforts to bring about regime change in Syria. But on the ground, the tide has long turned in favor of President Assad.
Let me introduce our guest for this edition of the debate. Journalist and political commentator Richard Millett joins us from London. We have author and historian Webster Griffin Tarpley joining us from Washington. Gentlemen, welcome. Richard Millett, the U.S. adamant in its arming of the opposition. Wait a minute, they call it the moderate ones. This insistence on arming this moderate opposition, does the U.S. really even know who they are, given the fact that they know there's a track record of some of these arms falling into the wrong hands?
Well, obviously, it's problematic as to who is moderate, as you have suggested. I think the latest idea is that the Islamic Front are the best hope of representing the future of Syria. And out of this Islamic Front, there is a possibility that there could be a leader who could present a more moderate view of the Syrian people as well as Islam. And I think that is obviously the hope, because there is no hope for Assad to continue in his role, or the regime as it is to continue in the current role, and there is no hope for ISIS or Al-Qaeda or their affiliates, Al-Nusra, or whatever you would like to use the term to describe as terrorists, to continue also with the possibility of running a future Syria. So yeah, I mean, it's very problematic, but there is a search on at the moment for who can best represent a moderate force in Syria, and it's not Assad, and as you say, it's not the terrorists.
Well, when you answer that, Richard Millett, you weren't yourself 100% confident about how the U.S. has reached out to the latest, this Islamic Front, of which, by the way, they totally rejected that outright, saying we're not going to talk to the U.S. This lack of confidence perhaps is reflected in many respects by the intelligence community in the United States. So isn't that a dangerous game when time and again now the U.S. has come out and said we're going to arm the so-called moderate opposition?
Well, I mean, the role of America is not necessarily to arm. It's to sort of support technically. I mean, the arms seem to be coming mainly from Saudi Arabia, and America, to all intents and purposes, has turned away from using force, as we saw with the potential after the red line had been crossed of Assad using chemical weapons on his own people, and then the further reports of war crimes being shown that he had committed against his own people. Even then there was no use of force, either directly by America or using that way suggested by you of supplying arms. So really it is, at the moment, the search is on, number one, to find a moderate in the opposition, and number two, to reach some sort of peace or ceasefire via these diplomatic negotiations.
Well, Webster Griffin Tarpley, let's talk about this threat. It's been a repeated announcement now by the U.S., the threat of these foreign fighters. James Clapper came out and said it's 7,000 of them. Some estimates actually put it at 150,000 from some 50 countries. Even the number of countries is said to be higher, which includes Europe, with some some of these insurgents to be Americans tied to Al-Qaeda, the Al-Nusra Front in particular, aspiring to attack the United States. And we still have the U.S. saying they're going to arm the moderate opposition. This threat is a big deal, isn't it? We're seeing the reaction from the U.S. Why would it then come out and say again that they are going to keep arming the moderate opposition?
It's very surprising. We've just had the first certified British suicide bomber going into action. A tragic and wretched story for this person from Sussex and for his family. Yesterday here at the White House, we had the state dinner for the French President Hollande, and even though he's somewhat changeable in his affections, the warmonger role seems to be a permanent fixture of Hollande, and we had a rather dangerous combination with some warmonger toasts being made at this state dinner at the White House, a couple of 100 yards from where I'm sitting. So this has not been pacified. In other words, the threat of military action continues to be there. The war party here was, of course, checked back in September, October, thanks primarily to Putin and Lavrov, for whom the American people, I think, have reason to be grateful. But now there's been a kind of a gradual drumbeat, and it takes the following form. It's all around the humanitarian intervention, the so-called responsibility to protect, or R2P. And this focuses on the siege of Aleppo, where the terrorist rebels have been gradually driven back, and some places like the Yarmouk camp. And what goes on in these places, of course, is that the rebels are the ones who prevent humanitarian supplies from getting in. In the majority, certainly, of cases, it's the rebels. They have every interest to block the humanitarian aid deliveries. And then, of course, they turn around, and the U.S., the British, and the French have been working on this United Nations resolution since about 7 to 10 days ago, I would say, which focuses precisely on these humanitarian issues with then humanitarian corridors of some kind. Now, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov correctly has said that this is based on unreality. It is absolutely unacceptable. Russia and China will and certainly should veto this. The structure of the resolution has been if the aid is not delivered within 2 weeks, then the countries that want to can begin taking sanctions or maybe even military action against Syria. So this is a one-way ticket to war. I would just point out, historically in the 20th century, the person who really pushed forward the idea of responsibility to protect is, of course, Hitler. In the Czechoslovakian crisis of 1938, Hitler's position was responsibility to protect, in that case, Germans, Sudeten Germans inside Czechoslovakia. And in that period, the Sudetenland became the humanitarian corridor. So humanitarian corridor, when you see that word, just like no-fly zone, means acts of war. It means a general Middle East war, which nobody can want. So the perspective, of course, here is, when does it end? These imperialists seem to be one-trick ponies. They're like a crocodile. They only know how to bite. That's all they know how to do. And this, of course, puts a big question mark over the future of the world. As far as Kerry is concerned, there's worry about his sanity. Has he begun to lose his marbles? When the neocons lied, the neocons knew they were lying. People like Bush and Cheney and Wolfowitz and Feith and people like this. They had a whole theory of lying. They knew what they were doing. Kerry seems to believe the nonsense that he tells when he says that President Assad foments the presence of al-Qaeda for public relations purposes. We have to scratch our heads and say, has Secretary of State Kerry gone off the deep end? Shouldn't he be removed from office because of manifest mental instability?
Well, based on that, Richard Millett, John Kerry did say that Assad actually, in that opening of the Geneva II conference that occurred a couple weeks back, that Assad is a magnet for terrorists. Now, my question to you, Richard Millett, is this. Let's put a simple analogy into the picture. This Homs evacuation of civilians seems to have worked. At least you got some 200 civilians that have been so far evacuated out of that area. But I would think that based on just simple logic, if this is caused by these terrorists on the ground, instead of there being a focus on a transitional body as the opposition wants, why not focus it on eradicating terrorism? I mean, if they're the ones starting the fire, let's put them out instead of working on other things that follow that as a consequence. So my question to you is, why is this insistence by the so-called divided S&C not to have terrorism as a focus, which is what the Syrian government delegation wants at the Geneva conference?
Well, that's what Assad obviously wants to paint the picture as, that he's fighting terrorism. And to an extent, what Kerry is saying is that because of what's been going on, because of this horrendous civil war, where, let's face it was Assad who started this 3 years ago when there was a peaceful civilian uprising, and Assad shot down his own people, that unfortunately over those 3 years since, it has attracted terrorists, and now obviously Assad is saying, oh, we're fighting the terrorists. This was all instigated by Assad, and he's willing to destroy Syria. Whether he destroys it or whether the terrorists destroy it.
Well, let me come in and ask you a question, Richard Millett. The last round of Geneva talks, there were 1,900 people who were killed. Were you aware of the breakdown of which groups were killed in the 1,900 number that I'm citing? Do you know that breakdown?
Well, I mean, I don't know why you're picking on 1,900. There's been 130,000 people who've been
because
killed,
that was
including over 10,000
children. It was a long-awaited talks that finally took place. The last round, 1,900 to be killed during the talks. Out of this 1,900, there were roughly about 430 civilians. The rest were Assad forces, along with some of these insurgents. You're saying that Assad is instigating this. I find that to be hard to believe, along with some other people, I'm sure, when there's Syrian army soldiers that are being killed.
Well, of course the Syrian army soldiers being killed now, but in the beginning Assad killed his own people, and it's taken 3 years now for obviously the rebels have been armed, so the rebels are obviously going to kill Assad's troops. So there is a war going on. I mean, your analyst in America talks about the potential for Middle East war. If he turns on the television, he will see one happening now. In Syria, 130,000 people dead, including over 10,000 children. We have seen reports of disgusting torture by the Assad regime. That, in my book, is a Middle East war. Whether you call it, it's spilling over into Jordan, it's spilling over into Syria. It's happening now, and you don't need any encouraging by any outside group. Unfortunately, you've got Russia and Iran on one side, Saudi Arabia on the other side. It would be... It's a fantastic idea, but if Iran and Russia stepped away from Assad, Saudi Arabia stepped away, and this is a proxy war, isn't it really, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And this is now being fueled by both sides, really. And if both sides did step away, then that would be the one chance to cool the situation in Syria and allow the diplomatic process to take over. But Iran and Russia are fully committed to supporting Assad, and Saudi Arabia are fully committed to supporting the opposition. And we're seeing the slow destruction of Syria and the continued slaughter of Syrian people, who are the main casualty here.
Sounds exactly like the question Webster Griffin Tarpley that the Britain's state TV, the BBC, asked in a press conference from Lakhdar Brahimi, which there came no answer to. Saudi Arabia is known for arming these terrorists, forming some of these terrorists under one umbrella. Yes. And of course, you have Iran as being one of the countries not invited. I mean, at this point, given the track record, Webster Griffin Tarpley, of the failure of the Geneva talks, which by many accounts it has been deemed as such, why is there not a movement towards inviting Iran to the talks, given that the track record speaks for itself, that it hasn't bore really any concrete results?
Well, I would certainly advocate the immediate presence of Iran in this. The State Department argument is that Iran is a party to the conflict. Well, if they believe that, then in the same breath they should be saying Iran has to be invited, because as Lavrov points out, the point of peace talks is not to invite people you like. It's not your birthday party. It's supposed to have the presence of the countries whose cooperation is essential to create a durable settlement. So that should be done. I would also point out, I cannot see how Ban Ki-moon can stay in office. I think whatever the mechanism for impeachment might be in the UN Charter, and I don't think it's actually spelled out, one of the things in the UN Charter is that the Secretary General of the United Nations is not supposed to take dictation from any country or group of countries. He's supposed to be an international civil servant. Ban Ki-moon has flunked the test. Back to this question about peaceful demonstrations at the beginning. I had an opportunity to investigate that question a little while ago in both Homs, important center of this entire tragedy, and in Banyas along the coast. In both of those cases, as soon as there were democratic demonstrations in Homs in particular, there was a third force, people who came in with weapons and began shooting in both directions. In other words, provocateurs, and these were death squads. They were death squads sent in by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and like-minded people. And that was in the case of Banyas, before there was any democratic demonstration, there was a massacre of some poor Syrian logistical troops, draftees, who were cut down by some pretty capable guerrillas who had been shipped in by the United States from Libya, right? This was the project of the ambassador of the United States who was killed there. The most important question for Syria is to kick out the foreign fighters, repatriate them, expel them. As far as I can see, even the draft coming from the Jarba forces, the Syrian National Coalition, or whatever they called themselves this week, that draft says that the removal of the foreign fighters is a goal embraced by by the Syrian National Coalition. Of course, the Syrian National Coalition has no military ability to do that. The magnets for terrorism are Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia, MI6, the British intelligence, the CIA, and let's not forget the famous DGSE, the DGSE of France, who have their dream of reestablishing some kind of French colonial yoke over Syria, right, where they were in recent decades, right? They occupied the place until well into the 1940s. But the foreign fighters, most of the Syrian people on the ground who were in a sort of a middle position would say Syrians could solve their problems.
We're just out of time on this. I'm sorry. That's Webster Griffin Tarpley talking to us there, author and historian. And we also had a journalist and political commentator, Richard Millard, who spoke to us from London. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Takwai, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran. It's goodbye.
Council. They are said to be seeking to circulate a draft resolution which would authorize the use of force against Syria if it fails to allow aid into homes. Russia and China have said they will veto such a resolution. Meanwhile, the U.S. spy chief has called for military aid for insurgents. The U.S. National Intelligence Director, James Clapper, says more military training and equipment for the militants will boost them against Assad. Observers unanimously believe that Washington and its Western and regional allies have exerted all efforts to bring about regime change in Syria. But on the ground, the tide has long turned.
As talks continue in Geneva, we'll continue to strengthen the moderate opposition. That was what President Barack Obama said while hosting France in a lavish ceremony in Washington, a stance that was also shared by France. Why does the U.S. continue to think that arming the opposition will lead to a positive outcome, never mind what they call the moderate opposition? In this edition of The Debate, we'll discuss the prospects of the Geneva Conference, which the Syrian delegation says the focus should be on terrorism, not the transitional governing body, and why the prospects of parallel talks between Russia, U.S. and international mediator Lakhdar Brahimi also look to lead
people to stop violence, to stop terrorism.
Today we presented our main document outlining the various steps and principles that need to guide the transitional process.
Russia, the U.S., as well as the UN Arab League envoy Lakhdar Brahimi have held separate talks over Syria, which many construe as a sign that the negotiations in Geneva have failed. Meanwhile, fierce fighting continues between the Syrian army and foreign-backed insurgents in the key region of Qalamun near the Lebanese border, with the army making more gains.
nowhere.
Syria's peace talks once again hit an impasse. Representatives of the government and foreign-backed opposition have confirmed that they have been unable to push the negotiations ahead over the priority of top demands by the two sides. While the government delegation says fighting terrorism should be the first priority in the Geneva talks, the opposition insists that the formation of a transitional government and the resignation of President Bashar al-Assad must come first.
The Syrian delegation has confirmed once again that it respects the will and determination of the Syrian.
The army has seized control of the strategic town of Al-Jarajir. The Syrian warplanes also pounded the town of Yabrud, the last insurgent stronghold in the mountainous Qalamun region. Meanwhile, in Homs, relief operations have resumed to ease the ordeal of the people in a besieged area of the city. The aid deliveries and evacuations come just a day after they were suspended due to what was described as logistical problems. Hundreds of civilians have already been moved out of the city as part of a UN-brokered deal between Damascus and the militants. The US and its Western allies have tried to take the issue of Homs to the UN Security